Okay, so hello, my name is James and I am a student here at Cambridge doing a master's in engineering for sustainable development. I did my undergrad in mechanical engineering. I worked for a few years and now I'm here looking for a change of career, which is why I'm delighted to be joined by Janina Schnick. Hello.
Hi, yeah, nice to meet you, James. My name is Janina Schnick. I've been working in international development for about 10 years now. I focused mostly on sort of sustainable agriculture and more recently climate change. I'm currently based in Germany, working for the bilateral cooperation program of the Ministry of Agriculture here. And before that, I spent 6 years in East and West Africa, working on agricultural projects and with a range of governments as well. And yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Cool. So yeah, clearly there's going to be a lot to get into, but let's just start at the beginning, I suppose. Where did this idea of international development as a career path come to you? Was it obvious?
So I think I studied modern languages at Magdalen, and I can't say that I sort of went in with the idea that I wanted to go into international development. But what I did know was that I wanted my career sort of have an impact or to work towards solving sort of bigger problems that impact humanity. And I suppose there's an element of sort of cross-cultural communication that is also in modern languages. So I started exploring sort of various areas very quickly while at Cambridge. I was part of the UN Association, for example, got to travel to the headquarters in Geneva with them. And I did some travel with a college travel allowance in one of the summers, I think during my first and second year. So yeah, all of that sort of sparked an interest in the sector and then sort of slowly developed into something a bit more concrete. I managed to focus a little bit more on the non-linguistic, more sort of socio-political subjects in my final year. Borrowed a subject from PPP. I don't know if it's still called that, but yes. So basically something that was a little bit more related to actual development in developing countries, and so try to branch out into that in my final year. At that point, I think I was fairly certain I wanted to go into that sector, but not necessarily what role exactly or which sort of area, like health or agriculture. I hadn't decided on that yet.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Sounds like you made the most of your time at Cambridge.
Well, we always have the advantage of the year abroad as linguists, and so you have a lot of time to play with during that time, also to explore different things. So I definitely used that as well to volunteer with an NGO and explore that a little bit more while I knew that I still was going back to do my final year and didn't have the pressure of immediately finding a job as well.
What volunteer work were you doing, just out of interest?
Yeah, so I spent most of my year abroad in Italy, but I worked for an NGO there that had projects mostly in Brazil and also in Ethiopia. So I just kind of, I was just volunteering for them, but I basically helped them out with anything that needed doing in the project management or communication with the partners. I translated documents and yeah, basically sort of a little bit of everything. But I also got to go to Brazil with them on a sort of monitoring mission. So I got to see the projects on the ground, which was really exciting. And then just before that, I did a short project in HIV/AIDS awareness raising in Togo. This was, again, just volunteering. And then that was followed by an internship with UNESCO, with the German representation at UNESCO in Paris. Which was an interesting experience because it was more sort of the diplomatic side of things, as opposed to UNESCO probably wouldn't always be described as development. So that was interesting as well.
Okay, so it sounds like when you're going into your final year of your university, you've had quite a few different experiences, been to quite a few different countries as well. So yeah, I guess what was your thought process? You said you didn't really know what like role exactly you were going for, but how you had to figure it out somehow.
Yeah, I mean, so coming with a modern languages degree, it's not immediately that obvious what you're going to do with it, because it technically prepares you for lots of things. I mean, there's also just translators and interpreters working for the UN, for example. That's sort of something that people maybe consider the more obvious. But yeah, I was very conscious that I was coming into the sector as a generalist, and I had lots of different transferable skills, but nothing sort of very specific. I wasn't a doctor, I wasn't a lawyer. So I looked for roles that I thought corresponded to sort of my skill set. So there was definitely communications roles that I think I looked at, or sort of and also general sort of coordination, project management. I definitely also looked at just what was available, because I was very conscious that just gathering any sort of experience at that point would have been useful. I there was this internship scheme that connected Cambridge graduates with Cambridge graduates in Geneva working in the international organizations there. And we had an event about that, just learning more about it, and I applied for that. That's how I got to do an internship at the Gavi Alliance in Geneva, and so they do vaccines in developing countries, and that's kind of how I got into the global health sector. I'll be honest, it wasn't the only sector that I was looking at, so it wasn't a very sort of targeted approach. It was more sort of what issues interest me and what roles fit my general skill set, and then definitely went for lots of them, and this one worked out, and that sort of initially set me on a global health path, but then also gave me lots of experiences that I'm still using in my job in agriculture now.
Okay. So how long were you at this internship for then?
That was just for a summer. It was
Okay.
2 or 3 months, I think. And after that, I got to attend the Global Health Summit in Berlin at the time, through some connections that I'd made. And I met someone from this organization, this consulting company called Seek Development, and the CEO was part of the team that set up the Global Fund to fight tuberculosis, AIDS, and malaria. So they're also based in Geneva. So basically, she had lots of clients in the global health space, and she was specifically looking at building an advocacy strategy for the Gavi Alliance in Germany. And so I got talking to them at that event, and they then sort of created this job that I ended up doing for about 1.5 years on creating and developing this advocacy strategy, asking the German government to contribute more funding to this organization. And it just so happened that I had worked with them, I had direct experience with them. I also happened to be German. And so, that was just an example of networking really working out, but it was pretty much by chance that happened.
Okay, I mean that's really interesting. There's quite a few points that I want to go from there. So firstly, we've just started talking about your first long-term job, and yet you've already done all these different things. So what I want to ask is, are you particularly going out and seeking all these opportunities to go to Brazil and work for this company and represent these people, or And if so, like, how do you do that? You know?
Yeah. I definitely sort of put myself out there and quite broadly as well. So for the internship in Italy, for example, I went on the internet and just looked up all NGOs in Bologna, which is where I was going, and emailed the ones that seemed interesting. I didn't just email everyone, and I did try to customize my messages a little bit, but I looked at their websites and targeted especially the smaller ones, because often they're it's easier to get in touch with people, but also they are often short on staff or can use sort of an extra hand, and so that's often quite attractive if you have someone offering their work for free. Of course, if you can work for free, so I'm not saying you should necessarily take unpaid internships as well. And then I would say in hindsight, and what I'm doing more now, or what I've been doing more in the last couple of years, and what people are increasingly using, is LinkedIn. It's very easy to look people up on there and find either organizations or jobs that sound interesting and reach out to people. You might not always get a response, but it's definitely you know, the more you try, the more you're going to succeed as well. Learning about what people are doing, even just to get an idea of what a certain job, and maybe that looks interesting, is like. And sometimes opportunities can arise from that as well. You get talking about a specific topic, and opportunities come out like that might not be advertised anywhere, or there's something that they point you to in another a peer organization that does something similar that they know about. So it's definitely useful to just sort of start building a network of people that are in this space that you want to be entering, that you can either draw on for advice, or just to sort of build out the network and make sure that you have connections.
Yeah, some very good advice there. Just building on the idea of building networks. When you go to these events, maybe somewhat cynical on my part, but are you looking to make connections? As in, you know, when you talk to someone, are you thinking like, should I add this person on LinkedIn, looking them up later, or maybe even beforehand, or are you just kind of going with the flow, perhaps?
So I personally am not very good at sort of spontaneous networking, so I do like to prepare. I mean, if you're very outgoing and it's easy for you to talk to people, it might also work for you to just see sort of who's there. But as long as there's an agenda or something, some informational material in advance, I think it's always a good idea to prepare. So have a look if there's presentations or sort of sessions on something, who are the panelists, who are the speakers, who of those could be interesting to talk to, and also who's accessible. I mean, like the prime minister of a country is probably not going to talk to you, but if you can find a technical person that is working on something that you find really interesting, or they have a position that that's of interest to you, there's nothing wrong with sort of stalking them in advance and learning a little bit about their work, so that you also have something to say when you do get to talk to them. People also really like being asked about their work at these events, I've found. They're there obviously to promote their organizations, and they're happy to, I think, be asked about their work. Everyone has a nice business card that they want to give out. So I would be confident about that. Of course, there's always going to be lots of competition, but if you prepare a little bit in advance and you have something interesting to say, or just some interesting questions to ask, honestly, that's often enough. And then, of course, there's also, I think, always opportunities to connect with the audience. There might be people in the sessions that you've selected that you might want to talk to because they have a similar field of interest, or you might get to talk to someone who works for an organization you didn't know about, but they're also listening to the same topics that you are. And so it's always, in my opinion, less daunting than to just get into a conversation with the person who's sitting next to you, who kind of seems at the same level, and is not someone sort of the celebrity speaking on the podium.
Okay, very good advice again. I guess let's just sort of continue on our journey, if you like.
Mhm.
So you're working in Germany for around 2 years. Um, but then obviously you moved on. What was your sort of thought process behind that?
Yeah, so after working in global health and in the international development space for a little bit, I was very conscious that I didn't actually have any sort of academic background in the topics, any of the concepts underlying sort of projects and all of that. So I knew that I wanted to do a master's at some point, and since I knew that my bachelor's wasn't specifically targeted at international development, I decided to do a degree in that area, still going for a fairly broad approach. So I did development studies at IDS, the Institute of Development Studies, which is at the University of Sussex. And I chose them in particular because it's quite a small institution, and it's also very applied. So all the fellows that are teaching there are also involved in projects on the ground. So they use their own research often in their classes. And yeah, it's a very sort of practice focused course. And yeah, it turned out to be a very interesting experience that that allowed me to shape that I wanted to go into afterwards. And I felt like I had a little bit more of a theoretical grounding in the topics that I was actually working on. And definitely also thought it was useful to have a little bit of work experience to draw on in the course. That was actually a requirement of this particular master's. But it makes a difference if people have already worked in development, either in the field or even just like I had in a consulting firm, and to be able to apply everything you're learning to that as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, having work experience was a prerequisite for me to do my course as well. And it definitely alters your perspective on what is a very academic topic. So a few questions here. So and I'm sure perhaps many of the audience are thinking about dissertations and big research projects they might be doing. To what extent, I assume you did something like this. Yeah, to what extent was it, were you thinking ahead about what you might do afterwards, and how useful do you think it was for your later career?
So I can talk about my own experience, and then another experience that's maybe a little bit more helpful here that a friend of mine had in my year. So I did a dissertation in collaboration with the Malaria Consortium, but that was through a connection that I had at IDS through a professor there, and there was an opportunity. And because I had experience in global health before, they connected me basically, and there was a specific study that they were doing on the use of mobile phones in with community healthcare workers in Mozambique, and I also happened to speak Portuguese, and so I basically contributed to that study. In theory, I think if I had wanted to stay in global health, I probably could have pushed that connection harder and see if there was a way to be involved with the organization afterwards. I didn't do that because I got a different job offer, but I have a friend who was more in the sort of indigenous land rights space, and she wrote a dissertation very specifically on a very specific subject that hadn't been explored that much before. And it was both because she was interested in it, but also because there was genuinely a sort of gap in knowledge that she wanted to fill. And I know that she was subsequently able to make the most of that specific topic and worked specifically on that. And she was subsequently also approached by people working in that area because it's quite a small area. So she still works in that area now, and she really capitalized on her dissertation topic to sort of sell herself as an expert on that. And there were jobs specifically related to that. So it's definitely something worth considering if there's like a specific topic you're interested in that you want to be working on afterwards as well.
Yeah, I'm just interested to get it the right way round, as in, if do you end up in a career because it followed on from a project you were interested in, or do you do the project because you're interested in the career, if that makes sense? I mean, were you like
I would always advocate going with your interests first, because there's no guarantee that following a certain course of action is going to get you the job or the career that you want. And you're always going to want to be engaged in what you're working on, I think, as a priority, because it's always going to get you useful experience. And if you then have a specific role that you want to be working towards, that's still going to be useful for that. But I think, unfortunately, with the job market as it is, you can't fully control what you're going to end up doing. There's a lot of competition in, especially the big organizations in international development. And so I would always advocate going for something that you're really interested in. Of course, that should be related to what you're working towards in terms of the career, but I'd go that way around.
Okay, that's good reasoning. Some points I didn't consider. And so on that kind of note, you obviously mentioned you got a different job. How did that come about?
So I, after sort of having seen a few different approaches to development, so in the global health scene, but also just through my studies, through the masters, we got to know about a lot of different projects. I was interested in trying something a little bit more unconventional. So I applied for this job at One Acre Fund. It's an originally American organization, but it's a social enterprise. And so it takes a little bit of a different approach to development that isn't sort of purely aid. So it's not project-based. It's basically an ongoing program that is always there. There's no exit strategy or anything. It's not a 3-year cycle of funding or anything. It's an ongoing, basically, service to smallholder farmers. And the service, so it's basically, just to explain briefly, it's basically like Amazon for smallholder farmers. So they can order farm inputs and some additional products like solar lamps in advance of the season, and basically on credit, but it's just credit in kind. And so they get the inputs at the beginning of the season, and then throughout the season they have to pay back the value of what they bought. And that's kind of unusual, because most organizations would say, well, we're working with very poor farmers here, why should we take money from them? But I found the approach very interesting, also because the organization was very successful in getting those payments back. So clearly that was working, and farmers were really increasing their yields by a lot. Their living conditions were improving and so on. And they had a role in government relations, so working with ministries of agriculture in particular across East Africa. And I had some experience through my global health role before that, working sort of in advocacy, working with governments to get funding for development. And so that's, I think, sort of the main skill that got me that job. I was really interested in the approach and very excited about that. And I found the sector interesting as well. So that's what I went for.
Yeah, it sounds like a really interesting job, and I'm going to ask you a whole bunch of questions on it. So was this like something that you stumbled upon, or like something that you carefully researched and narrowed down from a wide range of options?
So I would say that I definitely looked at a lot of different options after my master's, but what I was very certain about is that I wanted to spend time in the field, as they say. So like in a developing country, implementing or at least contributing to the work there, as opposed to working from somewhere new or as their headquarters. So I definitely looked at jobs in the field, and that did narrow down quite a lot, because often those jobs require a lot of experience, and I had some experience, but I didn't have that much experience. So I looked at opportunities that basically that I qualified for despite only having a couple of years of experience, and where I could draw on the experience that I had already gathered before. This particular job, I knew about the organization from a friend who'd applied for it a couple of years before that. So I also had sort of a reference of knowing, okay, this seemed like a good organization. And yeah, it was, in the end, there weren't that many organizations where I really got sort of to the final round, because it's often quite competitive, and there's a lot of people with a lot of experience also applying for jobs that have lower requirements, unfortunately. So yeah, I would say the long list shortened itself on its own by virtue of not meeting the requirements, or not being an organization that I necessarily wanted to apply for. I will also say that I don't think I tried very hard with the big organizations. I don't think I applied for the UN or the World Bank or anything like that, because I knew it was really hard to make it through there, especially as a European, when you're not in any of the quotas of countries that are underrepresented.
Yeah, makes sense. So you're kind of aiming for something achievable. I don't know if that's the right word, but
yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, I think you'll have to prioritize what's most important to you. So is it the type of job, or is it where you do the job? Like for me, the most important thing was to get field experience. I knew that I wanted to do that. I knew that I needed to do that to move my career in the direction I wanted to. But it could also be, if you definitely want to work in education or something, then you go for that sector. But I think it's important to identify sort of a specific goal, whatever that might be, and then sort of be okay with a little bit of deviation from maybe your ideal scenario, but you're still then ticking the most important box, or the one that's most important to you.
yeah. Okay, so you mentioned that friend introduced you to this organization. Are you having a lot of these conversations? I'm just curious. I mean, for me, looking for a job was always quite a solitary experience, but maybe I'm doing it wrong. I don't know what your thoughts are.
So I know that you're supposed to have a lot of these conversations. I have definitely tried it with different applications in the past. And I do think, especially in very competitive organizations or very big organizations where it's hard to stand out, it can be really useful to have someone who introduces you to someone, just so that they're aware of your name. Sometimes that results in a little informational interview, but sometimes it also just is a quick email exchange, and they sort of remember your name. But yes, I also think it's beneficial to have these conversations to learn a little bit more about the organizations or the kinds of jobs that you're applying to, because they might look different on paper, or they might not be exactly what you're what is important to you. So just to give an example, working for the UN sounds very exciting, and I'm not sort of advocating one way or the other here. But it is a very big organization, and the work that you're going to be doing is probably going to feel quite small in relation to sort of the bigger picture, depending on what you're doing. there's going to be a lot of bureaucracy. Decisions can take a long time. There can be hierarchies. And so if you know someone who works for the UN, you can ask them how it is and get sort of an idea of the organization and sort of an assessment that I think you're not going to be able to get in an interview, because you're not going to want to ask very critical questions, or they're not going to give you all the negative aspects. So I think it can be useful for that as well, where you can have sort of an unfiltered idea of what it's like.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And on the subject of setting expectations, had you been to Africa before, essentially? It just seems like a huge step. I mean, I'd love to go out. What the work you're doing sounded really valuable, and it definitely correlates with a lot of what I've been learning about, you know, working with the local population, empowering them to make their own decisions, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd love to go out and do that, but I've never been to Africa. I don't like hot countries. I don't know. It seems like such a, you know, a risk almost. What was your thoughts on that aspect of the job?
Yeah, I mean, so my first experience in rural Africa was during my time at Cambridge, when I went to Togo, and that was just for a month or even a little bit less. And I will admit that it was a little bit of a shock to the system. I mean, this was also extreme. I was there in a village without access to electricity and no phone network and no paved roads and all of that. Realistically, it is not usually like that unless you're, you know, that's the kind of setting that you choose. But most jobs are based in a town. And honestly, then when I worked in Kenya, most of the time, or half of the time, I was in Nairobi. That is a big city, and it doesn't really feel like you're in the field. Also, the climate's very nice. It's not very hot and it's not very cold. And anyway, just advocating Nairobi here. There's definitely something to be said for trying that out first, I would say, even just traveling there. It's the climate does make a huge difference. West Africa, for example, is very oppressively hot most of the time. You also get the harmattan, the sandstorms and things like that. So climatically, it can be very challenging. But again, if you're in a place like Kenya or even Ethiopia or other countries, it can be quite different, and it can be quite pleasant. And then also testing out sort of your comfort level. Not everyone's happy sleeping on the floor somewhere in a mud hut. You also don't have to do that in order to work in Africa, but it's useful to know sort of what you're comfortable with and what you and then I would also say that it's useful to get some sort of experience of organizations working in that setting, because it's often quite different from companies or organizations operating in the Western world. There's a lot more things that go wrong all the time. Things are a lot slower. If you're trying to get anything done, you're going to have a lot more patience, and just the sort of general assumption that things are not going to go according to plan, or they're going to take a little bit longer, or it's going to be more difficult. There's going to be roadblocks. People communicate differently as well, depending on who the organization is led by. I definitely had to learn a lot about how to communicate with different people of different cultures, and everything that you sort of learn about work interactions in the Western world might not necessarily apply. Giving feedback, for example, isn't something that is very common in other settings. And so being exposed to things like that as well, and seeing whether you're comfortable with them or how you react to them is definitely very useful.
Okay, yeah. So building on one of your points, which was, you know, finding the balance. Not everyone wants to sleep on the floor, as you say. How did you find your balance, I suppose? Because we all want to get paid, but then there are other things that matter. What's your thought process on that?
Yeah, I didn't, when I first moved to East Africa, I didn't have that much of a choice. It was sort of a small town that that One Acre Fund had their headquarters in, which was in the field, quite close to the smallholder farmers they worked with. But what I did find was very helpful is to have a network or a community sort of locally. So there were actually lots of other foreigners there living with me. And it's really helpful then, I think, to establish yourself a little bit more whilst being in this really unfamiliar environment, also having like some sort of familiarity, and definitely also having a support system in the organization. So housing was provided, and the transport, there were cars, and there was advice on how to act sort of locally. If you don't have any of that, it can be a lot more difficult, I think, to sort of establish yourself unless you're really adventurous. I did try that with a brief stint in Mozambique just before my master's, where I was helping out the NGO that I worked for in Italy before, but I was on my own on the ground doing like a couple of months of helping with a few things there, and there was no support system, and it was a lot harder, and the same environment. I mean, this was still not really very rural, but the same environment, being a small town, felt a lot tougher than when I moved to Kenya, where there was sort of everything was a little bit more established, and there was guidance on how to act. The reason that I moved to Nairobi was more because of my work, because I was working a lot with national government, and not necessarily because I was uncomfortable where I was living before. But it is also, I think for me, what was also important was accessibility to airports, and sort of being able to travel home, for example, when I wanted to, and being able to travel for fun as well. That's harder when you're somewhere far away from an airport, or you have to go to a regional airport first to travel to the capital, and then from there you travel on. That makes every exit a lot harder, and so that, I think, is something to consider, and also other family considerations. There weren't that many people, for example, that had children outside of Nairobi. Some of them did, but again, sort of your circumstances define a little bit what you need as well.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot to consider. I'm conscious of using up a lot of time, so just to try and cover a lot of ground in a short period. So obviously you spent 4 years with the One Acre Foundation.
The fund.
Fund, yeah. One Acre Fund, sorry. And then again, you decide it's time to move on. So if you could just discuss briefly sort of what your reasoning was there, and then sort of how you've obviously you're in a slightly different sector now, and what your thoughts on that are really relative to what you were doing before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so directly after being in East Africa with One Acre Fund, I moved to Guinea in West Africa, and that wasn't random. That was because of my husband's job, and so I basically followed him there. But I briefly worked for Care International there because they were trying to set up operations, and that again, I got that connection through a friend who works for Care, or worked for Care at the time. But then I spent most of the time there working with Dalberg, which is an international consulting company that focuses on international development. And I did know them from Nairobi already, where they have an office. So that was a connecting point. And then they had this delivery unit that was supporting the Prime Minister's office there. So there was also the government relations connecting point. So for me, it was really interesting to be able to use those experiences that I'd built before, but then in a completely new context. I mean, West Africa really is quite different from East Africa. And there were definitely lots of sort of unfamiliar moments for me. But there were also a lot of experiences that I could draw on to be realistic about what it was like to work with ministries, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, and to work on different projects. So yeah, it was a great opportunity to also be very close to the government. My role in East Africa had been working with government and trying to get their support, whereas in Guinea I was on the other side, and I was actually with government, developing things with them and trying to help them execute on certain strategies in the agricultural sector. So it was also refreshing to sort of have the immediate attention of the government that you're working with as well. That my time in Guinea was unfortunately interrupted by the pandemic. But my current job is also working very closely with government, this time with the German government. But again, I'm kind of on the other side. So I'm now very conscious that all the funding part of everything that I was working on in both East and West Africa was completely removed from my job at the time. And I am now basically in the position of the donor. So I plan and implement projects on behalf of the German Ministry of Agriculture. And this is a process that's involved in everything that goes on in the field as well. I just wasn't exposed to all of the procedures and all of the decision-making processes that I'm working on now, conceptualizing projects and all of that as well. So it's been very interesting to, again, see the whole sector from another side and be able to learn about everything that is involved in mobilizing the funding and making projects and then getting them off the ground in the field as well. So it's definitely a lot more removed, my job now, as opposed to what I was doing before. But it's also very useful to understand things from a different perspective.
Okay, so just taking a broad view now to sum up, it seems to me like your career has had a natural progression, if you like. So you're in a role and you get some experience, and then the next role is different. It's a step, but it's not too much of a step. I'm just trying to relate this back to choosing your career. So, I mean, I guess the question is, to what extent should you pay attention to your past and your previous experiences when trying to chart your new career course, or at least the next step on your career course?
Yeah, let me maybe start by saying that maybe on paper my career looks sort of linear and planned, and it all sort of makes sense in retrospect, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it always felt like that sort of as I was going through it. I think it's always useful to be able to use the experiences and skills that you've built in the past, unless it's something that you really hated and never want to work on anymore. I think all experiences, all professional experiences are going to be useful in one way or another going forward. Of course, if you have a specific skill, like I'm assuming you're a bit more specialized based on your degree, there is also just very specific skills that can be brought to specific jobs. And so that it's very useful to have something like that, because you actually have a technical skill to offer where you can apply that to probably many different jobs, but at least it is something that's special, sort of on the outset specializes you a little bit. I would say that I tried to use my experience as much as I could, but also tried to always have an additional goal in mind every time that I switched roles. So as I was saying, like I was interested in sort of an unconventional approach to development when I moved out to East Africa. Right now, what I'm seeing as a really useful aspect is both sort of understanding development from a donor perspective, But I'm also excited about the climate aspect of the work that I'm doing now. So it's projects on sustainable agriculture, but it's also a lot of projects for climate resilience. And that's a space that I'm increasingly interested in. So I'm trying to really capitalize on that aspect of the role, and sort of, as I'm in this role, I mean, I hope my employer's not listening to this, but I'm not going to be in this in 10 years from now, but I'm trying to build experience now that will be useful in a future job, whatever that might be. And I'm trying to think about how I want my current skill set or the current things that I'm working on to be useful going forward in a potential future job. So you can make it look quite linear in retrospect, but I wouldn't worry if it doesn't feel like that in the moment. It definitely didn't for me.
Okay, cool. I think that's a good place to finish, sort of summing up and looking towards the future. So yeah, thank you very much for your time today. I've definitely enjoyed it and I've learned a lot, and hopefully other people will find it useful as well.
Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity. It was nice to chat.